Some stories are meant to fade, buried with the dead, but some refuse to be forgotten. My grandmother told this one in hushed tones, her eyes shadowed with something I can only describe as fear. Paul, my grandmother's childhood friend, had returned to the island after many years away. His arrival was met with joy, and the family threw a celebration in his honor. The house buzzed with laughter, old friends rekindling memories, the sound of clinking cups filling the night air. But as the festivities carried on, something unseen lingered just beyond the lantern's glow, something waiting. A few days after the party, the island's peace was shattered. News spread quickly. Matt, a neighbor in his 50s, had fallen ill. The sickness took hold of him fast. As always, my grandmother visited those who were ill, sitting with Matt's wife as they tended to him. Before leaving home, she told the family, "If you don't see me when you return, I'll be at Matt's house." It was a simple statement. No one thought it would mark the beginning of something far more sinister. That afternoon, my grandmother helped Matt's wife with chores, washing clothes in the heat of the sun. Then, a scream. One of Matt's children ran out, their face pale with terror. "Mom, it's Dad, he's not breathing." They rushed inside, but it was too late. Matt's body lay still, his lips parted as if caught mid-sentence. The island had no hospitals, no doctors. Death was handled in the home. Neighbors arrived, their wailing filling the air, mourning the man who had been alive just that morning. A white sheet was pulled over his face. By sunset, his body lay in the center of the house, but something was not right. Miles away, Paul and a few family members were still exploring the island, unaware of what had happened. When they heard the news, they decided to return, but Paul, unfamiliar with Matt, wasn't in a rush. "I'd like to finish my tour," he said. "One of you stay with me?" Toa, a young family member, agreed, and so they walked together, never realizing that something had already begun following them. The trail was quiet, then a figure appeared ahead, walking toward them, a man moving slowly but steadily. Paul did what any polite traveler would do. He smiled and greeted him. "Well, hello there," Paul said. "How are you?" The man turned his head slightly, and then he spoke. "Hello?" His voice was calm, too normal, too alive. Then he smiled, a knowing, eerie smile. Paul thought nothing of it. But when he turned to Toa, expecting a response, Toa had stopped walking. Paul frowned. "Toa?" Toa didn't answer. He stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. His eyes were locked on the figure walking away. Paul let out a nervous chuckle. "What's wrong? Just some guy." Toa finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "You spoke to him." Paul blinked. "Yeah, so?" Toa's hands trembled. "You shouldn't have." Paul felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. When they arrived at the neighbor's house, the air was thick with the scent of candles and sorrow. Matt's body lay in the center of the room, wrapped in white. Paul felt uneasy. "I feel weird being here," he whispered to Toa. "I haven't even met the man." Matt's wife overheard and gave him a soft, knowing smile. "Would you like to see him?" she asked. Paul hesitated. Toa gripped his sleeve. "Are you sure?" Paul sighed. "Yeah, I'm sure." Matt's wife gently pulled back the sheet. Paul stepped forward, and the world tilted. The man lying before him, the dead man, was the same man Paul had greeted on the path, the same man who had spoken to him, the smile still etched onto his cold, lifeless face. Paul stumbled backward, his breath hitching. "No, that's not possible," he whispered. He turned to Toa, his chest tight. Toa nodded, his face pale, his voice barely above a whisper. "We saw him." Paul's stomach churned. Toa's voice trembled. "He said hello to you." Paul felt sick. His skin crawled with something primal, something that told him he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, spoken to something that shouldn't have spoken back. He muttered an excuse and fled the house. Back at my grandmother's house, Paul was pale, shaken. She was in the kitchen, calmly serving food, unfazed by the grief that lingered outside. When she saw him, she asked, "Paul, are you hungry?" Paul shook his head. He felt watched. He felt followed. "I need to leave," he whispered. "Before I go insane, I'm shaking." My grandmother set down a plate, wiped her hands on a cloth, and looked at Paul with an expression he couldn't read. Then she spoke words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Paul, you can't hide from ghosts. They'll find you anywhere. What would you do if you encountered a ghost? Let us know in the comments.